I don't think I have that much to share with you that you don't already know. When Doug asked me to give a presentation, I actually declined. I didn't really feel I had anything very useful to say. And then he asked me again, and of course, as devotees, we know that serving devotees is the most pleasing thing to Bhagavan. So I think you can decline once, but maybe not twice. So I accepted the second time. So my contribution, my function, I think, is to say something about Sankhya. I'm not sure I can say much that you don't already know, but inspired by the fact that that Stitati and a couple of you have quoted from the Bhagavatam, I'd like to just start with a quote, a nice auspicious quote, which I take shelter of whenever it seems that the claims of the Bhagavatam have no bearing at all on my known reality. And you're familiar with it, and it's from the 12th book. The literature which reveals the qualities of Bhagavan is literature that is true, that is auspicious, that is purifying. It is such literature which is pleasing and charming, and which always provides an ever-fresh, joyful experience for the mind. It is such literature which dries up the ocean of despair for all people. The literature wherein the glories of Krishna are recited, and here's the bit that I find useful, even if there are errors in every line, in every single line. So for me, the way I read that, of course, that could be a reference to errors in a kind of kavya type of sense, you know, in a kind of literary, you know, that there's doshas, there's flaws in the kavya. But you could read that as saying, even if there's total mistakes made in the way that the universe is construed or metaphysics is understood. The whole point of it, of course, we all understand as devotees, is to develop our love for Bhagavan, even if there are errors in every line. Okay, so clearly the metaphysics of the Bhagavatam and the Bhagavad Gita is Sankhya. So Doug suggested I say a little something about what we know about the history of Sankhya. It seems to have been can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Everything okay? All right. Seems to have been the oldest metaphysical system that at least is recorded in the Sanskrit literatures. So we find the earliest references probably in the Shvetashvatara Upanishad, where we have the famous, I think Prabhupada quotes it, you know, the male billy goat enjoying the female billy goat. You don't want to read that bit in a modern classroom with our modern feminist sensitivities. But so you have the idea of Purusha Prakriti. You have a reference in the Shvetashvatara to the, not so much the three gunas, but synonyms of the three gunas. I think it's the red colors, it's red, black, and white. So you have these sort of earliest references to what later develops into Sankhya. And interestingly, the Shvetashvatara calls that whole thing yoga. And it's actually imparted to Kapila, who's by Shiva. So the funny thing that Vaishnavas appropriate the Shvetashvatara Upanishad. We like to talk about the two birds in the tree. It is an in-your-face Shaiva Upanishad. Rudra, Hara, there's no mention of Vishnu there, but it is appropriated by Vaishnava theologians. So that we find there the earliest sort of references to Sankhya. Kapila being a sage, he seems to have been a very significant sage. He's referenced all over the Mahabharata and referenced in commentaries as a sage. He becomes obviously, or he's represented as a incarnation of Vishnu in the Bhagavatam, but everywhere else, I don't know about Vishnu Purana, perhaps he's an incarnation there. But in the other texts, certainly the Shvetashvatara, the Mahabharata, he's a great sage. And there's a whole book just on Kapila and the various ways he's represented. He's probably represented more than any of the other ancient sages. So he's receiving these teachings from Hara. The Shvetashvatara doesn't actually mention Shiva, it says Hara and Rudra, but it's a Shaiva Purana. So there we have our earliest germs references to Sankhya. Sankhya means enumeration. The word means remuneration. And the other source, which I think, and I keep telling everybody who is interested in listening, that really the moksha dharma of the Mahabharata, when Bhishma is lying on the bed of arrows, and we all know the stories, waiting for the Uttarayana, and his 60 days of discourse, and there's a moksha dharma section. It's full of proto-sankhya and proto-yoga and proto-vedanta and proto-dharma. And that's really a source that waiting for not just one PhD, but numerous PhDs that can be focused on that. So anyone really interested in the early expressions of Sankhya, moksha dharma would be a place to look. So then it seems like a lot of early unsystematic, just like the Upanishads, and the moksha dharma is not. It's more systematic than the Upanishads, but still not systematic, not systematized. So we have different, 26 elements or 25 or 24 arranged in different ways. So there seems to have been a lot of Sankhya literature that was lost. And so sometime scholars date perhaps the 3rd century, the cyclicality becomes the go-to text for Sankhya, and that's what we study now, or that's what people interested in Sankhya study, the Sankhya-karikas, and with the commentaries, of course, as with any Sanskrit sutraic tradition. So we have the other 5 so-called schools of Indian philosophy. By the way, this idea it's a late idea. There are 6 schools of Indian philosophy, probably not more than 1,000 years old. It's not clear when that emerged, but it's from the point of view of Indian textual tradition, it's a late idea that there's obviously so many more schools. Where's Shaivism, where's Tantraism, where so many other things. But at some point, this idea of 6 schools emerges. Some Brahmin in some court somehow, made a proclamation that there were these 6 recognized schools, and they all have their canonical texts. But the Sankhya doesn't. Much later on, there is a Sankhya Sutra written. Scholars would date it around the 16th century, 15th century. So there is a Sankhya Sutra, a big, huge thing. So all of which is to say, the Sankhya literature that we have, if we're interested, of course, there's the Bhagavatam, but if you really wanted to study Sankhya, you'd have to study them. Obviously, you, as devotees, were interested in how Sankhya is presented in the Bhagavatam, but you'd have to look at this larger corpus, and that corpus that we have today would be, Svetara is just a few words, it's not going to be very helpful. Moksha Dharma, again, probably, you'd have to really put some work in to sort of try to systematize, but you would find very interesting statements, which might throw light on, or might just sort of trigger a new way of thinking about something. So you'd have the Moksha Dharma, then you'd have the Sankhya-karika with its commentaries, Gautama, the Gaudapada. You'd have the Yuktadipika, which is a commentary on the Sankhya-karikas, again, full of useful insights and information. And then you'd have the Yoga Sutra tradition, which of course I'm the more familiar with. So although I read all these other Sankhya texts, I wasn't reading them from the point of view that the Bhaktivedanta Institute, or at least from a cosmological point of view. It'd be interesting to go back and look at them from that point of view. So basic Sankhya philosophy, then we all know there's the 3 gunas, and the reasons for given, at least in the Sankhya-karika, don't seem to be very convincing. Why are there 3 gunas? And the karikas say, well, because we see out in the world out there is happiness, distress, and delusion, and therefore there must be some causal entities, and everything out there it can be categorized as happiness, distress, or delusion. It's not clear how that applies to physical reality. That might apply to mental reality, and therefore there must be these 3 gunas. So sort of why are there 3 gunas and not 4 or anything else? I haven't encountered a very coherent explanation for that. So there's these gunas, And then there's a cyclical model of creation. Now, where does that emerge? It's not in the Upanishads. I'm going to guess it's in the Moksha Dharma. And there's not a very good reason given. Why should there be a cyclical universe? Why can't there? The Mimamsa tradition rejects it. They just say, why do we need to have cyclicality? Let there just be reality. Same as the ancient Greeks would have said that there was just eternal reality, anadi, beginningless. Why and how this notion of cyclicality enters into it? I've yet to encounter. I'm not saying there's no explanation for that, but I've yet to encounter it. The fact that Vishnu sleeps and then, for a cosmic cycle and awakes is, oh, well, good luck sort of, putting that as an explanation as a scientific conference. So clearly Vishnu doesn't need to sleep. So that's not, you could say that's a Leela, but fine, but that's obviously not an explanation of why there needs to be cyclicality. But there is, and it seems to have filtered into Jainism and Buddhism. So it comes more or less pan-Indic, the idea of cyclical creativity. Although Mimamsa school reject it until later Mimamsa, because the Mimamsa want an eternal Veda. For them, the Veda is eternal, and they don't even want, and that's one of the reasons they won't accept an Ishvara, a God, because if there's an Ishvara, then somehow or other the Veda becomes secondary to Ishvara. They don't even want that. They want the Veda to be eternal and absolute because they want the Vedic sacrifice to be eternal and absolute and not derivative or secondary or in any way or conditional on anything else. The Mimamsa school of Vedic ritualists, which is what ancient Indian religion was for millennia. All of this yoga, sankhya is going on in the margins. Let's just be clear about that. So then within this cyclical model, then you have the quiescent gunas. And one commentator in the yoga tradition nicely puts it that really, what does that mean? That tamas is neutralizing the nature of tamas is in exact equilibrium in terms of neutralizing the nature of rajas. Rajas wants to stir, rajas wants to act, and tamas wants to suppress and still, and when it gets to some kind of a 50-50 point, then basically tamas is neutralizing rajas. And I used to think about this as, think about the gunas as three distinct things. I'm not sure that works, because it can't be three distinct things, because if one is increasing, then the other's diminishing. Well, where's it going? And whereas the increase in if sattva increases, as we know from the Gita, right, when sattva is prominent, rajas and tamas are decreasing. But that can't be, from a point of view of physics, if something's increasing, well, where's that increased sattva coming from? And if something's decreasing, well, where's that going? So I don't think of it anymore in terms of like three entities, but rather one entities with three. It's one substance and it's infinite. Prakriti is infinite. Doesn't have a vishesha, a delimitator, that a boundary. So somehow it's infinite, and it has these three properties which can morph somehow or other. And at this point, I think we have to bring in the Maya of Vishnu, right? Devi hi isha guna mai mama Maya. This is my Maya. The gunas I'm not sure we can explain them from the point of view of modern physics, but I'd like to talk to Doug and others a bit more about that. It seems to me the only way of explaining how this one thing, Prakriti, and it's not that the three gunas is Prakriti. It's not that Prakriti has three gunas. It's not that there's a Prakriti with qualities of three gunas, like an Atman, which has the quality of consciousness. It's not like that. In my understanding, that Prakriti is the three gunas. So rather than saying the three gunas, you say Prakriti. So there's Prakriti, and it has these three potentials. Somehow or other, one guna can transform into another, and lose power, and so therefore sattva becomes dominant. And I'd like to think more about that and talk more with some of you about that. In the beginning of the cosmic cycle, it gets triggered. Now, the atheistic Sankhya, there was an atheistic Sankhya, and that's the Sankhya that Vedanta debates in the Vedanta Sutra. Vedanta Sutra, actually, its main opponent, it has two main opponents. not Buddhism at all. Has very little to say about Buddhism. People like to think that, Vedanta Sutra sort of somehow defeated Buddhism. There's no textual evidence for that whatsoever. There's a few verses in the second chapter on Buddhism. Its main opponents are Samkhya and Mimamsa. Epistemologically, Mimamsa. It's in other words, it makes, there's a lot of response to Mimamsa's claim because Mimamsa is situating its authority on the older Vedic texts, the Vedas, the Brahmanas, and the Vedanta, the Vedanta, which is the Upanishad. So so part of the discussion, its main opponents, Purva-paksha in the Vedanta Sutra, is Mimamsa in terms of which of the Vedic corpus is more important and influential, right? So they minimize the importance. Mimamsa and Vedanta is the anta, but its metaphysical opponent is Sankhya now, and clearly it's a non-theistic Sankhya. It must have been quite prominent for Vedanta to occupy. It takes on Sankhya in the first adhyaya, and then a good portion of the second adhyaya. And the metaphysical issue at stake, because obviously Vedantins accept Sankhya because the Bhagavad Gita is part of the Prasthana Traya, right? The three sources of authority of Vedanta: Upanishads, Vedanta Sutra, and the Gita. The Gita is Sankhya from beginning to end. Has whole chapters, right? 14, 17, 18. It has Kshetra Jnana. It's all over the place, right? Nitya Sattva Sto, right from the beginning, rise above the gunas. So it's not so much the metaphysics, the guna model that Vedanta opposes, and we are Vedantins, let's just remind ourselves, but it's the idea of an unguided. So there was a school that clearly a dominant amongst the many schools of Sankhya, because the Puranas are all Sankhya, Ayurvedic Sankhya, theistic Sankhya was dominant because the Shaivas adopted into the Shaiva traditions. Of course, they had Shiva and Paramashiva and Sadashiva, and they add a few categories on top. But the metaphysics is Sankhya. And maybe we should just quickly mention that the opposing metaphysics is the Vaisheshika Nyaya Mimamsa traditions, who are Satkaryavad, right? So Satkaryavad means all effects ultimately dissolve into a cause. So all the effects are present in the cause. The karya sat exists. The karya, the effect, sat, it already exists. Where does it exist? In the cause, right? So olive oil exists in the olive. It just needs to be extracted by processes. That's Satkaryavad. And Asatkaryavad, no, the effects do not exist in the cause. And therefore you have a plurality of causes. So Nyaya comes up with 6 in the early days, and then 7 padartas. You have substances and qualities and karma and various things that then come together and produce an effect, which is a brand new thing. It didn't exist, and you need to bring these causes together, right? So these are the two rival models of metaphysical models of ancient, certainly post-Upanishadic period. And Sankhya really dominates, comes out, wins, so to speak, although it absorbs all the terminologies and categories of Nyaya. You can use all of those Nyaya categories, and you can use a lot of Nyaya thinking, which I think is really important for some of the things that BI might be interested in. So you have the gunas. So then at the beginning of the new cosmic cycle, the Purushas are injected into Prakriti. Okay, this is where Vedanta is going to step in, and this is the argument. Well, how do they get injected? You have to introduce an Ishvara, because Prakriti by itself is inanimate. It's not going to do anything. It's not going to say, let me jump on top of Purusha. And Purusha is just pure consciousness, has no will, has no thought. It's just Sat Chid Ananda. It's just pure consciousness. So how do the two come together after this huge cosmic cycle? What is similar to like what triggers the Big Bang? What's the trigger? So therefore they're going to, this is going to be one of their main reasons for introducing an Ishvara. But from the point of, so where I want to go with all this now, which it perhaps more relevant of what we need to think about, how we need to think about in terms of cosmology. So the Purushas are injected, and somehow or other, and this is another reason why Nyaya says you got to have an Ishvara, somehow or other their karma accompanies them from the previous cycle. Now, where is that karma in between cycles? Because everything dissolves, and karma is samskara. And what is samskara? It's kind of like a psychic atom. If you want to think of an anu, if you want to think of a mahabhuta as gross particle, well, there's subtle particles called samskaras, and these are just memory imprints. But all of that dissolves at the end of the cycle. The subtle bodies dissolve. Everything's dissolved. There's only the three gunas. But those jivas are in some dormant state. Of course, the Vaishnavas would say, Ramanuja would say, they're dormant within the body of Vishnu. But then the new cycle arises, right? They're not liberated. They need to get re-injected. But how do they start? So therefore, their previous karma then determines where their next situation. And there has to be an Ishvara then that connects that karma. Where is that karma? It doesn't exist anymore. It's dissolved. The samskaras have dissolved. So therefore, you have to have an omniscient. This is one of the reasons why Nyaya says posits an Ishvara to explain karma, because the Nyaya are arguing against Buddhists, and Buddhists accept karma and reincarnation. So therefore, you don't have to establish that. So where you want to, the debate with the Buddhists is, well, then what activates the karma? What activates to begin the new cycle of reincarnation? So that karma is the organizational model, my friends, that determines everything. And it determines everything out there. That rock that's been sitting in my garden for 14 billion years is not randomly there. It's there because there's some karmic reason for it. Maybe after 14 billion years, some farmer's going to stub his toe in it, and now it has its raison d'etre. It has its existential reason for being. Everything, not just our psychic and our physical bodies, but the world out there it is what it is. The shape of the bark on the tree out there, that bark is taking a left instead of a right, and the grooves of the bark is there for karmic reasons simply to satisfy the karmic needs of the living entities. No other reason at all. Everything. So this is the Sankhya, Nyaya, and Vaisheshika. Everybody agrees in this. Their disagreement is Satkarya, Asatkarya is on another level, and Buddhist Jains, everybody agrees with this. So that's the organizational model. So the jivas get injected, right? Samkhya has a problem, explaining this. It just doesn't talk about it. It just says they come together, and they say proximity, and of course, then well, what brings them proximate then? But let's not get into the philosophical arguments on that score. So I've mentioned this to one or two of you before. The way I think of it, so the injection of the Purushas in classical Sankhya is what agitates, it stirs the equilibrium of the gunas. They're in equilibrium, there's got to be a prime mover, right? As Aristotle famously put it. So something has to stir them. So we can, Vaishnavas, we call it, Vishnu glances, but part of that is the injection of Kala is Vishnu's glance, and which is really not really a glance. It's not like Vishnu really has to open his eyes and look. Maybe he does, but it's Vishnu's will. Perhaps he chooses to express his will through opening his eyes and glance. The real trigger really is the real cause for the variegatedness from that moment on is the karma. Living entities then somehow get injected, right? And first they get enveloped with Buddhist stuff. I think of it as, I've mentioned before, it's like if you blow up a balloon, and then you push your fingers into the balloon without popping the balloon. Now each finger is individually wrapped with the balloon, right? Each finger's got its own wrapping of the balloon, but yet that wrapping is simultaneously connected to the entirety of the balloon. Very important to understand that, to understand the mystic powers of the third chapter of the Yoga Sutras, by the way, because our individual chittas and buddhis is potentially connectable to the universal, and that's how you can manipulate. I think that there's a lot of interesting stuff in the cities if we study those carefully. Those who are interested in mind and consciousness and so forth. So then, so you can think about it. So starting off then from that point of view, you need intelligence, right? To experience karma, you need to have a faculty of determination. That's what intelligence is. It determines. Now, in classical Sankhya, buddhi comes first, and in the Bhagavatam, ego comes first. You can make arguments either way. I see right now, it seems to me, before you have ego, a sense of self, you have to have a sense of determination. You have to have an intellect. And second to that would come the sense of I am, right? You first should have to have a faculty to even be able to think I am. So it would make sense for me that from that point of view anyway, that buddhi comes first. Again, determined by karma, what kind of buddhi you get, what form of life, it's all going to be determined by karma. Okay, we have the story of Brahma making the forms, how that fits in would have to be another discussion. Then there needs to be that Atman, which is just pure Satchidananda, needs to have a sense of individualization. So it gets wrapped with ahankara, with the ahankara, subtle instrument or feature of ego. These are actually instruments. The instruments of thinking of oneself as a self rather than just an infinite sense of infinite consciousness, which is what the liberated state is for the Jnana traditions. It's just a state of infinite Satchidananda. There's no individualization there. Even though, of course, Vaishnavas, Krishna Das Kaviraj talks about merging in Brahman. But anyway, in that state, there's no sense of individualization. So then you need to have that sense to experience your individual karma that you're picking up from the past cycle. Then you need to have an instrument to sort through the massive sense data that's overwhelmingly out there. You'd be overwhelmed if there wasn't a mind sorting through it all. But we were blocking out 99% of sounds and sights and smells. So then that's the manas. And then you have this idea so then you need to have instruments to experience the world out there. And you need to have instruments that can function in the world out there, right? So it's not like you have the eyeball pops out of mind stuff. That's it's not the eyeball. The traditions talk about Shaktis, that there are powers. There are 10 powers, the 10 pranas. I mean, yoga talks about 5 pranas, 10 pranas. Sometimes they're called pranas, sometimes they're called Shaktis, that facilitate the workings of your knowledge acquiring senses, the ability to know the world out there, to know it visually and sonically, and the smell aspect, taste. These are the 5 ways to know the world out there. The discussion is, are there any more senses? But I see no reason to suppose that there are any more ways of experience than that, because even Krishna has the 5. If there were going to be more, then presumably Bhagavan would have them. And then 5 Shaktis that allow the arms to operate, and the legs and so forth, and the genital and the inner. So these are the instruments. Now you need to have objects of experience. So then you have your 5 tanmatras, the senses. So you can see how this can be construed as a kind of evolutionary process, with tamas increasing proportionately as we go down the scale of the tattva. Tattva just means tattva, the nature of tat, the nature of that. Tva is a suffix that you put to mean hood or nest. So that nest. So what is it? So therefore the tattvas. So the tanmatras then are the qualities that are perceived through the 5 senses. And according to Anyaya would agree with Sankhya here, that qualities, they need to be situated in somewhere, otherwise they'd be infinite. Sound wasn't located well, ether is a bit of an exception actually, because certainly Nyaya would say it's universal. I'm trying to remember what Samkhya says. Would they say that Akash is atomic like the other 5? I think they would actually. I think they would say that Akash, but I need to check that. Nyaya would say it's a. But anyway, these qualities need to be grounded. So tastes need to be grounded in ultimately subatomic particles. That's what we would call them now. They call them anus. And unfortunately, the word at the time when these texts were translated, anu was translated as atom, because that was the smallest irreducible entity at the time when these Sanskrit texts were coming into Europe in the late 1900s. And that time it would have been Newtonian physics. Doug can tell us exactly when they discovered electrons and protons and whatever they're talking about now. But so the word atom has been applied, but that's not correct. And anu, and that's the same in Greek, by the way. The word atom in Greek actually means an irreducible entity. So the anu then is an irreducible entity. And right now we're talking about muons and gluons, and like Sister D said, in 1500 years, they'll be saying, what idiots didn't they know they were, or, who knows? And by the way, this heads towards Buddhism, because Buddhists are going to say everything's infinitely reducible. You never end up with a reducible stop sign. They might be onto something. There's no way of disproving that. There's no way of disproving it, because whatever particle you end up saying, okay, now we've discovered muons and gluons, there's no way of knowing that itself could not be infinitely reducible. So that the Buddhists took that position millennia ago, well, many centuries ago. So these qualities these are the objects of experience that your karma requires you to experience. And they need to be grounded in substances. And so then you posit substances. And classical, by the way, Samkhya is inference-based. The beginning of the Sankhya Karikas, it says, we don't accept sense perceptions imperfect. And the scriptures, they say that they're tainted. Because of the Vedic sacrifices and butchery of animals, they're tainted. Therefore, we don't accept them as sources of revelation. So all of this is put together by inference, that you infer this by intense intellectual activity. You infer. Now, we started with the cosmic, and we've gone down to the irreducible atom. Well, if we have time, we'll go the other way and look at it, and look at Sankhya from the point of view of me sitting inside here, like Descartes would have done, and thinking, well, what do I actually know? What do I? So we'll do, if we have time, we can go the other way. But so that's classical Sankhya. It's an anumana. Prakriti is called anumanita. It's the inferred one. Its presence is inferred. And we know Vedanta takes the opposite view, but Vedanta takes the opposite view in terms of Ishvara. It's going to say, as Krishna Abhisheka, Shastra Yonitvat, which can mean two different things. It can mean that Shastra comes from Brahman, or we know of Brahman from the Shastra. And Vedanta would take the view, okay, through inference, you can know there's an Ishvara, but you know nothing about the nature of that Ishvara. Maybe there's 2 Ishvaras, maybe there's 10, maybe Ishvara's a demon. So Ishvara, we can only know by revelation. This is important. But everything else, including all the Samkhya of the Bhagavatam, we can, some classical Sankhya would say we know that through inference, deductive reasoning, empirical observation, and making deductions from that. It's important, I think, for us to know that we take the Bhagavatam as revelation, but the actual metaphysics, the nature of Godhead, is another thing that only Shastra can reveal, at least in classical Sankhya. Okay, so that's something about how this idea that Sankhya metaphysics emerges and dominates at least the Vedic traditions, although they disagree with at least half of the Sutra tradition, Mimamsa, and Nyaya and Vaisheshika take the Asat Karyavad, but that's a deep level disagreement. But in terms of categories like atoms and qualities and individuators and universals, Sankhya absorbs all of that. The Vaishnavas don't use that kind of language. So quickly then, if you looked at, so that's macro to micro. If you're looking at it from micro to macro, you could say, well, here I am, like Descartes, right? What do I know? Okay, well, I cogito ergo sum. Well, actually, yoga would say, well, there's no proof that you're sum, that you are, because your cogitating is already a secondary imposition on consciousness. But you could just look at it as the individual, understanding that there's consciousness distinct from the mind, from meditation, just basic meditational practice. You don't have to be on the highest state of samadhi to realize that you can still the mind and experience and still be conscious. So that doesn't take grand virtuosity in practice to know that consciousness is distinct from the mind. And then from there you can say, okay, so there's unconsciousness, but then, but I have this faculty that allows me to be thinking these thoughts. What Descartes thought was consciousness, what Samkhya would say is a bit distinct, so therefore I have a faculty of intellect. And then from there, and then you can go out, or you can reverse the process I just outlined. And I must have an organizational instrument. I must have an ego, because I think I'm me, and I know I'm not the wall over there. I know I'm not Fred Smith down the road. So there must be some faculty that gives me this sense of individuation, of ego. And then I must have a mind that's sorting through, because there's a sound. If I pay attention, I hear the sound I hear that truck right outside my window. But when I'm not paying attention, it's the cars are still going down the road. So there must be an instrument that's filtering that and basically blocking irrelevant things and only presenting input. And you could then go, and then I must have, and I perceive essential objects out there. So therefore there must be faculties, not just the instruments of sight. There must be shaktis, there must be powers. And in this way, you can reverse the logic of Samkhya from cosmic down to the individual atom, and you can reverse it you can look at the whole thing from the point of view of the observer, and then with all processes of inference. This is an inferential, it's an intellectual system. Although we think of it as divine revelation, the Bhagavatam, Samkhya doesn't think of itself that way. It thinks of itself as deductive, and in its pramana. The pramana it prioritizes, the episteme that it prioritizes is pramana, and it doesn't reject Shastra, and it certainly doesn't reject yogic, and yoga then. In the early traditions is a before this sort of idea of 6 schools of Indian philosophy, yoga is considered a branch coming out of Samkhya. So when you read Vyasa's commentary on the Yoga Sutras at the end of every chapter, he says, thus ends the Bharsha of Vyasa on Samkhya. He's thinking he's writing about Samkhya. So within Samkhya then, and we also know that Samkhya is synonymous with jnana. So Samkhya is the process of jnana. Krishna says, right? There's the Samkhya there's the jnana or Sankhyanam, and then there is the karma yoginam in whatever chapter 3. So Samkhya is synonymous with jnana yoga. In Vedanta, it's a scriptural tradition. The jnana yoga in the early period is actually Samkhya, and then of course Nyaya then it emerges as another kind of jnana yoga. The classical jnana yoga is Samkhya yoga. So it's intellectual, it's rational, it's inferential, and in that sense is proto-scientific. And we are looking for ways of, we're interested in seeing if thinking about it in different ways, we can find modalities of conversation with modern science. And that's my understanding of what we're doing in the conference. And it's an honor to, I don't know most of you. Only some of the older devotees like Druta Karma. I've been a bit of a lone ranger for a few decades, and it's an honor to be in your Sangha, and if I can serve in any way. Bit busy now, but at some point I'll retire, and hopefully I'm very, very interested in what you're doing, very interested in this conversation, simply because that's what intellectuals have done throughout the history of Indian intellectuality, be it Jain, Buddhist, anything. They engage the Purva Paksha, they engage the intellectual environment of their day. So this is what we have. This and therefore the Bhaktivedanta Institute is a wonderful expression and vehicle for that. So I'm sorry if I went on a bit. I blame Stita D for sharing his wonderful book, which sounds so exciting, and I'm really looking forward to reading it.
Advaita, I want to personally thank you for a very important talk of putting many of the Sankhya and philosophical themes in oh, I'm muted?
No, you're I think your wife is the only one that your wife is the only one that can mute you, Brahmacharya.
Well,
But
now you broke up.
all right,
Okay.
I can hear you.
Oh, I'm sure Kreitzer. So, okay, you can hear me. That's perfect. So anyway, you took a lot of the themes and integrated it in a way that I hadn't quite heard before. Others here, I'm sure, have, but I'm a geologist. Anyway, it was well done and well appreciated. But I wanted to point out to everyone here something special, and I'll show you what is special. What is special, if you look at the shelves over there, you can see there's a sign, please do not remove books from these shelves. That is a special collection of our library. And this is about a third of your library on display, about to be indexed. So we thank you very much. We can't thank you enough. Everyone here is peeking at the books and thinking, what an amazing collection. So I
you know, it was such an honor. It was such an honor. And I have an eternal debt to Srila Prabhupada for giving me Krishna Bhakti, which I'll never forget. And it's an honor, Brahmacharya.
And a few people are going to come tour, including Vasudha Narayan. I'm visiting her this week, then she's going to come the week after and tour the library. And we'll
Lovely.
So I wanted to thank you and point out to everyone, it's really appreciated. And all of your books are out of the warehouse and now being indexed.